Hey Bex, welcome.
Hey Jane, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I'm super excited to talk to you about somatic movement education because I don't really have any idea what that is. And I really sort of look up to you from your writing on somatics, I find to just be really unique and powerful, and I'm always finding nuggets from that I really that are really inspiring for me. I'm kind of new to the bodywork world. That the, my kind of in through massage and bodywork is how I started getting really interested in the human body in general. And so you are somebody that I've looked up to over the last couple of years as I've tried to figure out how to dive into this like massive world of studying the body and anatomy and somatics. So yeah, thank you for the inspiration, and also I'm excited to learn more about what it is that you do.
Rad. Oh, thank you. That's really great and really flattering to hear.
Cool. So before we talk about what somatic movement education is, why don't you maybe paint a picture a little bit of what your journey was like to get to that point of being an educator, kind of personal, professional, educational background leading up.
Yeah, so I grew up moving a lot. Like I grew up dancing, was kind of playing outside a lot, was kind of an active kid. I never really did team sports. Um, I have it'll kind of come out as we talk. I have more, I think, nuanced thoughts about cooperation and teamwork than I did as a kid, but I was very much like a loved to be a mover and dancer. And so and like was always putting on little dance performances and like organizing the neighborhood kids and so so it's been a part of my life for a long time. And then and kind of concurrent with dancing, I've also been a visual artist, which that some of that kind of influences some of my somatic work that I'll talk about later. But so in high school, I started studying yoga, and then like that kind of became my primary movement practice. I've still continued dancing since, but I sort of shifted focus to yoga. And then it wasn't until my late 20s that I did my first yoga training, which was about 15 years ago now, sort of mid to late 20s. I started my first yoga training, and there was a teacher in that yoga training, actually in my 200 hour and my 300 hour. So my first like two yoga trainings. I had two different teachers who were like the anatomy teachers in those yoga programs, who both came from body mind centering, which I'll talk more about too. And so they were teaching anatomy in a yogic context, but there were these juicy little nuggets that now I know to say were somatic that piqued my interest, where I was like, I have never heard, I was interested in the anatomy part before I started studying yoga more deeply and preparing to teach. But what they brought to the table from somatics and body mind centering blew my body mind. I had never heard, I never explored myself that way, even though I had moved and loved moving my whole life. I hadn't quite, I hadn't tapped into like flexing the capacity of feeling myself from the like from the inside out with the depth that I have practiced now. And so I was kind of took me a while to come back to somatics, but I was like it planted a seed that kind of started blossoming pretty immediately, whereas like I need more of this.
Can you give an example of what kind of nuggets would they give that brought that out for you?
Um, I'm trying to think of like a specific one. Like one moment that was really powerful with one of the teachers was I think we were doing something really simple, like lying on our backs, supine, and maybe we were doing work where we were connecting to the feeling of a certain organ. Maybe I have this, I seem to remember it was like my spleen, but you could pick any organ. It was like feeling the sort of fluid weight and hydrostatic support of the that organ, and tipping my spleen from side to side to roll to one side and the other. Um, and all kinds of other things like that, or even feeling my organ body in yoga asana practice. But I remember rolling from my spleen and maybe like leaving the room to go pee or something and coming back and feeling the energy of the room when I re-entered it, which in body mind centering, at least we'd call the tone of the room or the mind of the room, like what's the collective vibe that's palpable. But I came in and I was like, it's like everyone's like tripping on mushrooms. What is this? I want to like noodle around with people more like this. And so if I had to point to one piece, it was like that moment. And then lots of moments like that where I bring up like psychedelics because I was like, wow, there is this whole world like that I didn't know was there and accessible in ways like this.
Amazing. So that was kind of the thing that brought you to somatics.
Yeah, and a long kind of winding road. I'd always like bookmarked it. And so maybe I'll say, yeah, maybe that's a good concise beginning, like
Yes.
origin story.
Awesome. What is somatic movement or somatic movement education? I know you're also en route to becoming a somatic movement therapist. So would love to hear maybe even just a definition for somatics too. Like when I hear somatics and movement paired together, that's intriguing to me because I would think all movement is somatic, but I don't really know what somatics means.
Yeah, I mean, so and I love that like question, isn't all movement somatic? So somatics gets defined in a lot of different ways, and I kind of seeing somatics, the term become popular and maybe get a little watered down. I don't think it's a term that's vague, but I think culturally there's a lot of vagueness around feeling ourselves and our bodies. I think we're a really generally a really dissociated culture. I think that's why there's this aura of vagueness around it, is that for a lot of us, for me, like I said, even as a mover, I was stunned at how I'd been moving performatively, sort of from the outside in, and how different it felt to move from the inside out. And maybe that's a good, the pithiest way of describing somatics is that it's movement based on the internal experience of the movement rather than fulfilling an outer form or technique. Now, I do kind of combine them, and a lot of people do, where it maybe that's where some of the vagueness is too, is that if somatics is about feeling myself, it could look like anything from the outside. It can help sometimes to have parameters like a simple movement task that could be something like lying on your back and lifting a leg, or lying on your back, pressing into your feet, lifting your pelvis, or it could be something like a yoga pose or a dance move, but some kind of structure through form through which one could feel themselves. So sometimes that's a way that it can appear less vague from the outside. But fundamentally, somatics is about feeling oneself as an exploration of body mind and moving from sort of inner sensations, which we could dial into the variety of those, but kind of moving from our inwardness out instead of the other way around.
Yeah, I really relate to that transition. I've kind of been a lifelong athlete. I played soccer for most of my life and did some weightlifting at some point too, which was probably the thing that sort of connected my mind with specific muscles the most. But I would say it was not until I began this massage journey very recently that I actually started to have that. You're saying inside out versus outside in. I sometimes call it like top down versus bottom up. Like that really bottom up experience of connecting with the body and listening to the body and sort of letting the body lead. Whereas before it felt very much, even in soccer, I mean, it was, I guess, a mix, but often it was like, how can I get my body to do the thing that I want it to do in service of some goal?
Totally. And I really felt that because I did like ballet and pointe. Um, growing up, it's very much about those kinds of dance are about like kind of making yourself make the shape. It's aesthetic. And so I think there can be, like, I am a person who's been told, because of my dance background and because I have a practiced looking yoga practice, people have often said, oh, your practice is so beautiful, or speaking from the outside in, where I'm like, I was making my grocery list during class. So how beautiful is my practice? I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think there's a beauty in that too. But um, I'm struck by how it's also like a cultural value to make a cool shape, which is a dance goal, or to perform well in soccer or some other kind of team sports where they're different goals, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. But for me, it ended up in being kind of I've been trying to search for a word that's not judgmental, because I don't have judgment about it, but feel like I was kind of dumb somatically. Like ignorant is maybe a good word. I hadn't cultivated the ability to feel myself deeply yet, because I was in a dance culture, where I was making the shape at all costs. And I
Mm,
think some of it is getting older. And for me, it took having some injuries too to also want to investigate further how I could do things from a more interconnected place
mm,
and heal those injuries, and not hammer myself into shapes that weren't maybe good for me in the long run.
yeah. Yeah, for me, I don't even know that I knew that there was any other way of doing it. Like I didn't I felt it's not like I was kind of like choosing my options and like choosing like, oh no, I want to do the thing where I get my body to do what I wanted to do. It just I never heard people talk about another way. I imagine
Yeah,
that
it
comes up a
wasn't.
lot in
Oh,
your work.
sorry.
I imagine that comes up in your work where you're kind of introducing this to people for the first time.
Yeah, and in a way, I've been doing it so long that I have to remember what that was like, because I can go back, and it started in yoga, where there were subtle feelings I was starting to detect, and where I was learning to like interocept, to watch my breath, to feel my heartbeat, to feel other internal feelings. For me, it was really scary at first. I had a lot of trouble with panic attacks when I was younger, and at first, feeling my body was scary. It would kind of induce panic attacks. Now it has become the way through, where now paying attention to my body is the way that I'm like, oh, we're okay. We actually don't need to panic. But it was so new and felt really radical when I started yoga in high school, to feel things I could be more specific about, but that I'll just say like maybe energetic things or subtler things than I had been trained to feel in dance.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So maybe you could talk a little bit about the education versus therapy piece, and then also what it's like when you work with clients, either one-on-one or in groups or both.
Yeah, so as a somatic movement educator, there's a distinction between educator and therapist, and which I think is important. I would like to eventually be doing movement therapy, and I don't know exactly what it'll look like, only because as I engage with this work, I'm watching myself evolve. So I don't know if I'm going to end up taking on a specific focus. It could go directions like sort of towards occupational therapy, or towards working with specific things, or I could still see a general population. But now it means I have like a certain amount. I mean, still, I haven't added up the hours, but I don't know, a couple thousand contact hours of study, and to be able to call myself a therapist, which I think it's important that the term therapist is gate kept. I'll have to do a certain amount of like counseling study for some of the deeper psycho-emotional stuff that can come up when we're working with our bodies. I'll also have to do all the courses I've done again, but as an assistant, kind of like TAing. And then there are a few other professional courses I'll have to take. So I'm kind of looking at that. There's a part of me that wants to dive into that immediately, and I might take my time. It may be another 5 or 10 years before I'm there. We'll see. Yeah.
And then, so it sounds like the title distinction, it's pretty much about these extra requirements. Do you think that the work looks pretty similar still at that point?
I think it looks similar. I think there are certainly maybe deeper or bigger, like maybe if issues or pathologies that I would be able to address as a therapist that I just can't now. And if people come to me for something now, and this is true about myself as a yoga teacher too, when clients come to me, there are certain things I can handle. And I have worked with a lot of people with recovering from certain soft tissue injuries or pregnant people, things like that. And sometimes people have come for sort of deeper psycho-emotional issues or proprioceptive issues, things like that, that where it's my job to recommend someone who's better equipped. So it would be more like I would be more equipped to work with people having, again, love the word pathology, but working with kind of more serious issues, let's say, around movement and mobility.
Gotcha. So what does your
Yeah,
work look like now as an educator? Do you mostly do group work or one-on-one, or is it a pretty good mix?
pretty good mix. I'm doing, maybe it's been like filtering into my private yoga teaching for a while now anyway. So I'm in a kind of interesting transitional point where still most people come to me for yoga, though they know I have the somatic background. And so it ends up being kind of a mix, um, one-on-one. And I'm a little newer. Am I newer to it in group classes? I'm newer to teaching it as a sort of, I don't like the word pure, but as like a pure thing. My yoga for maybe the past 5, 6, 7 years has had a flavoring of somatics because I've been in the work for so long, but I've sort of just in graduating from part of my program. I mean, I still have a little homework due actually to make it technical, but um, in it, I've started to kind of flip the balance where some of my group classes are look less like yoga and are more like lying on the floor, exploring oneself inwardly. And something about graduating kind of it shifted something where I feel really ready now to teach it in a less familiar format, meaning it's been easier for a long time to sort of entice people with yoga or to give them something recognizable and to teach somatics through yoga. And I'd say now I'm starting to teach somatics through somatics a little more, or maybe through anatomy. I mean, it depends. It can look like a lot of things. Yeah. Or through foam rolling, even. Like there are a lot of ways to have a captive audience and then and then like be like, okay, whatever we're doing, anything is an opportunity to feel ourselves more deeply. What is it like in there? And
Yeah,
so, oh, and so that's sort of group classes. And yeah, I think I kind of described one-on-one. One-on-one, it might be, as I move away from just yoga, it might be doing a simpler movement action and investigating where a pattern might not be serving someone and how to kind of intervene or find a place for like new choice making and movement.
ooh, could you give an example of a like a pattern you might work on with somebody?
Oh gosh, I want to try to think of one of my own in a way. I mean, I guess I could talk about things I'm working on with people without naming names. Um, I'll talk about a personal one though. So there's a common pattern for a lot of people that develops in childhood, usually, like in even in infancy, which is sort of a startle pattern or a bracing pattern in our posterior chain, specifically in the muscles flanking our spines, of arching our backs and using those muscles to hold ourselves up. And so we do it for a lot of reasons in childhood, often being stood up or sat up before we're ready. It's a way to not fall.
Hmm.
And so it becomes a kind of operative pattern that I see in a lot of people and that I've seen in myself, where even if I'm not going to, I don't really think I'm going to fall even off of this chair, because I'm really engaged in this conversation with you, I can even notice myself. I'm continually reminding myself to like relax and broaden my lower back, that I don't have to participate with you like from my lower back.
Hmm.
And I see it in yoga. I see, and it sort of has other than like physiological effects, sort of even down the chain, or is it up? Like sometimes cause and effect are blurry, and that's great. but usually means using our lower backs too much and not using our glutes or hamstrings enough. Anyway, it shows up in a lot of ways. And I have found through, I'll just tell you the detail of what helped me uncover that. There've been a lot of things through time, like through my study and with my teacher in sort of private sessions that have helped me to unpack it. But one big aha moment was very weird and subtle. I'm going to do my best to put it to words because I'm still kind of unpacking what happened. And I may never know. Like a big part of somatics is learning to verbalize and tell stories about our inner worlds and to also hold them really lightly and to remember that it's storytelling. And so for me, the aha moment that really unlocked this pattern, even though I'm kind of always working on it, was like I start from anatomy a lot. So learning conceptually that my um like rectum is in front of my sacrum and tailbone. Something about that and feeling its forwardness helped me disentangle this like bracing pattern in my lower back when I was like doing a simple sort of log roll from side to side, like keeping my spine, not rolling sequentially, but more or less rolling with my spine in one piece from side to side. So instead of like arching my back to do it, somehow the like squishy organness of realizing that body truth, not conceptually anymore, but like feeling my like rectum and colon and anus sort of in front of my sacrum and tailbone, something about that feeling, like my back like released, and I suddenly found smoothness in this movement that had been difficult and jerky. So that's probably a good example because it's a very weird one and I can't really articulate what happened more than that. But and then I cried and cried and cried. And which, there's so many ways of motoring out or processing things that happen, and that's sort of the psycho-emotional component that like is a kind of a mystery, and a really important piece of it was whatever my body mind needed to do to process that new pattern. And in that moment it was like crying um without a good reason.
I love that example. I feel like it really points to what you were saying before about having some kind of container within which to do the somatic piece. So, like learning that bit of anatomy conceptually, it's so interesting how that can turn into a different kind of internal exploration and figuring something out.
Yeah, and again, it's still mysterious to me, but it's quite powerful. And for me, that's enough words for it. Like I sort of trust and feel the continuing change from having figured it out. And again, there's a lot of like journaling or drawing or storytelling, or people have a lot of different ways of expressing themselves. That's sort of the integration of figuring out some wordless body thing.
Yeah, the way that you're describing that too, I think it's something about your writing that I really appreciate is how non-dogmatic it always feels, which I find to
Cool.
be like surprisingly rare in this space. I mean, I think trying to pin down cause and effect in the body is so difficult and people are constantly doing it. I find it
No,
really,
you're right.
yeah, your approach always feels very fresh to me for that reason.
That's really amazing to have refracted back. Thank you. Yeah, I take that as a high compliment because that's really always my intent. It's probably one of the like core parts of what I'm trying to do is to be non-dogmatic about it, or like I'm always playing with language. And that sometimes means different language. I certainly have sort of an evolution in my personal use of language, and it sometimes means like how do I meet the person or people I'm working with like the language set that feels appropriate that we can share. That's super high compliment. That's awesome.
Yeah, I also let's see. So I have attended one of your yoga classes and then also a foam rolling class. And yeah, I was really struck in the yoga class. It was very different from any other yoga I've been to. in the way that you were blending this somatic focus the whole time. Like we did some log rolling, and you were kind of inviting a way of exploring that that was really new to me. And then I also really felt, I know that you're a longtime student of embryology. I would, by the way, be curious to hear how that kind of arose for you and played into all of this, the somatic piece for you. But I really felt all of that too, like what you're saying with developmental patterns. Yeah, I think it's really rare to have all of these skill sets woven together, and it makes for a really unique, it made for me a really unique experience of yoga, somatics, developmental embryology stuff.
Cool. So yeah, so I mean that weaving is both on the one hand very much like my sort of personal voice, and I like my embryological studies. And to be clear to people listening, though I try to be as rigorous as possible, that's also like a kind of cornerstone of my teaching practice. I'm not technically a scientist, though I try to approach things like one. So I just like to be clear about that. I'm not an embryologist, but I do like to talk to a lot of people. I like to talk to scientists, and a lot of the embryology stuff comes from my teachers. And so that's like a big part of body mind centering, is looking at overlapping waves of patterns from our embryological selves to our you know birth to 1 years old learning to locomote selves and beyond, where it's quite beautiful and astounding how many patterns in the movement of our cells, and then later sort of developmental movement, and then psycho-emotional and relational movement overlap or have resonance. And so while I'm obsessed with the embryological part, it's not my original idea. It's coming, that's a lot of that's coming from Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, who developed body mind centering, and then my teacher Amy Matthews, who's a student of Bonnie's, and um, puts a big emphasis on the embryology. But again, I'm like obsessed with it. And I can't remember his name now. There's also an embryologist I love. I'm blanking on his name, but who I could share with you another time, who's like a scientist, but also so really landmark in his, I'd say he's kind of a somatic scientist, whether he's trying to be that or not, in his approach to embryology as a manifestation of human intelligence, rather than the kind of fake objectification of science, which to me is the least rigorous part of science. Depends. We could dig into what I mean by that, but
About the objectification.
I'll say science is just shorthand. Science is assumption that there's not like local emergent intelligence co-creating the stuff in every spontaneous moment.
Beautiful.
Thanks. I think it's beautiful too.
I like to ask everybody this question, and we were just sort of talking about how much you value precision in language. In the bodywork space, we talk about tension all the time, especially in muscles, fascia, maybe other structures too, mainly those. Is that a word that you use, and what does it mean to you?
It's such a good question. Tension, I use it in a few different ways that are maybe, no, I don't like the word conflicting, and generative tension with one another. How about that? So in some ways, like I'd say the most sort of a more neutral reading of tension, like far from it being a bad thing, which sometimes it is a really uncomfortable thing that negatively affects our lives. Definitely true for me. But I'll say tension in a body as the experience of tightness or pain, or people could fill in the blanks with whatever words they use to describe what tension feels like in their bodies. My neutral reading of it is it's a place that's drawing our attention for a reason. Where we feel tension isn't always where a like problem is. sometimes a movement pattern somewhere else is asking too much of a particular place. For whatever reason, we develop a strategy in that place of holding. So that would be my way of describing one of the ways I think the word tension is used commonly, which, and maybe the most commonly, is there's a tension pattern sort of in our like upper backs between our shoulder blades. Maybe it's traps, rhomboids, a combination of things of like that starts also in babyhood from certain reflexes that are there for a reason and that we also kind of get locked into, or they're my strategy for holding on beyond my capacity is like right here. And that's a really common one for a lot of us. So there's that kind of tension, which someone might see a body worker like you for, and which I might see a body worker for, or I might kind of throw my arsenal of, yoga or foam rolling or even, using my attention to probe that place. And then there's also tension, to kind of preface this with, that's um, more like I want to say it's almost like a relationship laid bare between two or more things, like tension, and that could even be something in like day and night, or some like things appearing as opposites or complements. There's kind of a tension there in that, to me, the line of relationship, or maybe not line, the pathway of relationship is really clear. And that would be something I call tension. I hope that makes sense. Like, again, it's a place that draws attention. So by generative tension, it might mean even not fighting myself in movement, but finding a way to feel myself more. So an example in movement, like a physical experience of that, might be using a resistance band in an exercise, and the way that lets me feel myself differently than no resistance. But again, I'm using resistance in kind of a neutral light, if not positive. So, so I think there's like tension that gets colored as bad because it's uncomfortable or drawing my attention when I want to be paying attention to you, but I'm like, I feel my neck and shoulders. Or there's tension that's more like, these things are like clearly related and resting on one another, and I couldn't have one without the other, where that's what I mean by generative tension.
And so that would be like bodily structures.
Good question. Yeah. Or something more like theoretical or schematic or conceptual too. Um, or relational. Like even something like weight sharing in dance, where you're practicing, which is a little like contact improv, but practicing through touch, like giving weight to one another to feel ourselves,
Mhm.
which we're doing all the time and maybe aren't aware of. And there's something about doing it consciously, whether I'm giving my weight to the earth to receive support, to walk, or to rest, or giving my weight to a person, where it's the like psycho-emotional components are more laid bare about what it is to share weight, or to like, again, to like feel oneself. There's something in that resistance that and people are going to need different amounts. Some people, very little might register as too much for any given reason. For others, it might take a lot, which I would even say something you probably even see that in massage work. For whatever reason, our nervous systems are wired different ways, and some people don't need a lot of deep touch to feel, and some people probably want to get like beaten up in their like
Totally.
massage session. And I used to be that person more, and now I'm getting a little more like where like subtle can go really deep, sometimes deeper. So
Yeah. Same.
yeah.
Yeah, I've never thought of tension that way. That's really interesting. I remember that from your yoga class that I went to, us talking about kind of, I'm trying to remember how you said it. It was like letting ourselves find the positions in contact with gravity. Is that right? Something like that.
Yeah, I remember which class you came to, and I'm trying to remember what I taught in it, but I believe it was something about like resting and letting, I think I worked with the, like, it's a body mind centering concept of letting, if you can't let all of your whole body weight go, of letting communities of cells or even individual cells migrate to the place of contact. I think that's what we were working on that time. Yeah.
Yeah, sounds right. And it was really profound for me. It was like surprisingly, I mean, I also do a movement practice, a standing practice that's kind of similar in that through a specific spot in the foot is sort of all about trying to drop everything into the ground and really like connect with the ground and stand through the ground. But this doing this on my back, like I found myself on the verge of tears at a couple different points in the class. It was something about that, like more letting go and surrendering into that sort of connection or like generative tension, maybe with gravity that was, yeah, new.
Cool. And I mean, I would say it sounds like, at least from like you mentioning the practice that you're doing, like that's it. That's, and I think it's just more familiar in our feet because we're bipedal and walking more familiar, and yet still takes time and exploration like you're doing. But yeah, the way what you described at least sounds exactly like what I'm intending, whatever surface we're standing on or lying on. Could do it in handstand too. Just we have, some of us can't get there, or we have way less time doing that than than walking around. So
I've noticed that you use the word generative a lot and you just use it now, generative tension. And so I'm curious what you like about that kind of quality and maybe yeah, what makes tension generative?
I mean, it could definitely be destructive too, right? I think I'm also kind of, like I said, I was experimenting with language, and it's definitely somewhat on purpose that I'm trying to like reclaim the word tension as a neutral or even good thing. So I mean, when I use the word generative in general, I mean something like emergent, or more than the sum of its parts, or like open to surprise. So in the generative tension between people, like surprising things might come up, whether they're good ideas or that be good. Again, trying to get away from judgmental language always, but like new and surprising things can come up. And I think that's true of the relationships among all of ourselves, and then us as individuals in communities of various scales. So when I say generative, I'm often coming from a like sort of collaborative standpoint, a systems theory standpoint too, of like how do unintended consequences and surprising novel things um, arise out of things doing their stuff. Is that like too vague, or does that
No,
make sense?
no, not at all. It reminds me of something else I've heard you talk about. I've heard you talk about it in a trauma healing context, but I think you mean it more widely too in like a learning context, which is like um having more choices available and like available in the sense of like really available, really possible to be chosen, not just like theoretically available. And what it means to, and I might be again kind of like misquoting you, but what it means to make more choices available for ourselves and how we go about doing that. That feels relevant to what you're describing.
Yeah, no, and that's a big kind of, even that language, like having more choices available, really comes from body mind centering and from my teachers. And though I think I'm seeing it as a somewhat, I don't know if popular is the word, but as sort of a theme, maybe in different terminology in somatics, and in certain kinds of like yoga that's less about the outer acrobatics and more about inner experiencing. And yeah, I really do mean something like more like being less stuck in my patterns by more choice. Like an example of the most choiceless place would be like you said, like a traumatic place where I'm locked into one response, either by repetition of a thing that traumatized me, or by, like, it can happen through repetition or through a big event or intensity. And for a cascade of reasons, it's like that choice is locked in, and this thing happens, or even not this thing, something that somehow reminds me mysteriously of that thing happens, and I'm right there again. And I might not be meeting the moment as it would depend on your, I was going to say appropriately, skillfully, like those are kind of words coming from like different varieties of contemplative practice, right? But like, yeah, I may not be meeting it from the most choice. And so that's some of it too, is unraveling those places, whether it's a little thing like, my arm hurts. Oh, it's because I always hold my cast iron skillet this way. Well, why do I do that? Maybe I just do it and don't think about it. Maybe in ballet, I was taught to like draw my shoulder blade down my back or something aesthetically, and I actually don't need to do that when I lift my cast iron skillet or whatever. But even whether it's something kind of confounding, like a little movement thing where I'm like, oh, this clearly doesn't work for me. What am I doing that keeps re-injuring my whatever? Or something more like relational, psycho-emotional, like a traumatic response. Where I want to open up space. I think that those kinds of things have to be addressed on different strata. And sometimes something like talk therapy is more appropriate, but sometimes something like movement therapy is equally as important, or might help us sort of see whatever it is we're working with from another perspective.
Yeah, I would love to hear how some of the, I think you're calling it psycho-emotional stuff comes in for you. That was kind of my inroad with body work because I was having a lot of back pain. I've always liked massage, been getting massages off and on for many years, but I had really severe back pain. This would have been a couple of years ago, and decided to start getting lots of massages for it, and then just opened up all of this emotional stuff through the massage. And I wasn't necessarily expecting that, but it felt, I don't know about root cause, but certainly very involved in all of that back pain. And you mentioned before that there are instances where maybe it's not the right fit, or it should, somebody with more experience in that specific, or in some specific therapeutic modality might be a better fit. But when you do work with people in that realm, what does that look like, and how does it come into your sessions, and how does it interact with the purely physical layer?
Yeah, well, like I love how you kind of highlighted the acausality where we can't always know. So sometimes, whether this is true or not, I think of the like physical component, and then the story we've been telling ourselves about it, and the like psycho-emotional stuff, which I'd say is less the story. It's a little more maybe wordless or emotional. I like to think of them as like facets of the same sort of jewel of me or something, in that they're like co-arising. I can't know what caused what. It could be valuable to the story to figure out what caused what. Sure, that can be part of the work. But again, I also like engage with all of it as storytelling in a way that I think is important, because it gives us the opportunity to rewrite the story. Um, and so it can look like a lot of different things. With clients and students, it often looks like a dialogue. And this is the part I'm newer at, is working with people in somatics in this sort of, what does it mean to say purely somatic, but this purely somatic way, where it's less like I'm teaching a yoga class. Oh, this thing came up. Well, let's noodle into that more deeply because I have the skills and I'm developing them. Or sometimes now it's more like a soft tissue thing. Or again, like my lower, like I was working with a friend recently in sort of an experimental session, and where I was like, can I just try some of the new stuff I've been learning? And that, where we went into an injured spot. It doesn't always have to be working with an injury or pathology, but the friend had a place that was um, stuck. And so we used a lot of, we used the foam rollers a little bit, and we used a lot of actually imagery and dialogue too. And I did a little hands-on, like we do a little bit of touch, which some of the closest touch modalities to what I do are maybe like something like craniosacral, maybe even Reiki, which, to be clear, I don't have training in either of those, but but a lot of my colleagues do, and I've experienced those modalities. And just to give people a comparison, it's about sort of attentive hands-on and dialogue, and usually finding different tissue rhythms together through that process. And so with this person, who I know, so it also was kind of fun to explore. We had some sort of shared storytelling we could engage in. We I think of it almost like magical practice. Like we talked about what feelings, images, like things that sprung up. Like it's also about working with the unconscious and like what imagery is coming up now. I'm feeling this. Oh, I'm feeling this. I don't know how to describe what I'm feeling, but I felt a change. Or I'm think I'm getting a message from your tissues to like do hands off. Okay, do a little private, like personal exploration now. Maybe try a twist on each side. Like let's do a little more yoga. Um, so the sessions kind of have an arc to them where I would say I often start with something more like yoga or foam rolling, something maybe a little more physical. I'm kind of giving it air quotes because it's not separate, but something that's a little more like, I don't love the term, but like gross body or something. Just be like, all right, let's move, get in your body. You're like, ah, make some noise. And then let's kind of get subtler and subtler. And maybe it gets a little weird and trippy. And then being like, you know what? I think we're saturated in that. Let's do a little simple, gentle movement together and see what comes out. And then like journal about it or draw about it, or I don't know, go run around the block or have a conversation. Like to me too, it's also about engaging with the learning process in a whole person in a variety of ways. To me, that the change of activity is part of what helps us like motor out whatever just happened. And motoring out could be thinking about it, but in a very like overthinky culture, I even think writing or again drawing or like and more like left-handed writing or journaling where you don't pick your pen up, things that let your unconscious kind of get out whatever came up without you getting in the way of it is a big part of the process for me.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And it sounds so similar to what I want to do with people with body work. Like I'm kind of still figuring out the direction that I'm going, but I seem to be very naturally drawn to helping people with the psycho-emotional stuff. And that looks all kinds of ways. Like what you're describing, I've done a very similar sort of trying to explore the unconscious with what I call journeying, but a lot of the questions that you're asking, it's so cool to hear about how spontaneous it can be, and how many different, the drawing in particular is really fascinating to me. I think that's um, a really nice way to be very expressive and keep it nonverbal. I mean, for some people, I feel that a lot in my body work. For some people, we're talking the whole time, and it's really important and helpful, and we're really moving stuff by talking. And I think for some people, it's
Mhm.
like the last thing they need is more words.
Yeah. No, I find it's a like both are important to me and yeah, like you say, people have sort of different amounts of that they need or can tolerate, or different amounts that are restful or helpful or not. And I mean, that's kind of, it's kind of bringing me back to something I said earlier briefly, which is that I used to be a visual artist and really drew and painted a lot and even did some hand drawn animation. And then I've always had too many time consuming interests though. And so then got like more and more into the movement world. And I'm now finding the drawings coming back in a totally new way as I um, um, express my inner experiences through visual art, which is really fun and really surprising. I didn't see that coming.
Do you have like core teaching philosophies or movement philosophies that inform your work?
Yeah, I feel like I already said some things. I might say different things. um, maybe like at least now, and again, as I was saying earlier, it might be that someday I'm doing more sort of intensive work with like investigating specific traumas or uh difficult things that I don't think I have the capacity to hold for most people yet. Um, but for now, since I'm not there, usually it's more like I'm working with people with movement practices and though not necessarily. I guess I actually end up working with a lot of sedentary people too, whether it's like too much repetitive movement or not enough movement. Right now it's grounded, my like the way I teach is very grounded in like following curiosity. So that doesn't mean it's wrong. It's like often a hurt place comes up and we kind of want to follow that, though equally as much sometimes a hurt place comes up and my experience anyway is like, whoa, I cannot go there right now for whatever reason. So I am trying to hold this space that's more like where is it like interesting to go within your capacity? Like again, I think I'll be able to, for more people, hold more of a space of like, okay, we can go there if you want to. And I don't think I'm totally there yet for extreme, like really deep or big work. It depends on what the trauma is. So yeah, I'm like grounding it now and more, again, something that's neutral and that's like, well, is that place interesting? We could start from a place that's not a problem. Like you pick, what are you curious about? And even then, sometimes it's important for me to guide back and be like, okay, we were working on this. Shall we go back to that? Sometimes it's more like, oh, your curiosity is going here. Well, let's see where that leads us, depending on the person and the session and what our shared intent is, which we would usually frame before we start working together. So I'd say following your curiosity is like going to places that feel that are going to be different individually, that feel fun and safe is like tends to be my focus now, or painful and dark, but I feel okay going there. So something like follow your curiosity, maybe that's the most important pillar. Another one that I'm still really learning in my body is something like sometimes less is more, or small movements can be more healing than big movements, or less pressure might let me dive in a way that more pressure wouldn't. And I think that's quite individual. As I was saying earlier about like the way our nervous systems are kind of tuned. Sometimes we need more touch or force, sometimes we need less. That's so individual and it's going to change on a given day for anyone. But something like bigger isn't better. Maybe that's my principle. And because even in stretching, I think we can be sensation junkies, and I can be like, I'm used to working hard and feeling my muscles working, or like stretching and be like, oh, I stretch. And that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. But also, like, what I'm learning more and more from the somatic work is like, oh, what are the places, the interstitial spaces in between all of that sensation? How much sensation is actually under there, even if I'm not looking for this big familiar thing? And then sometimes it's really integrating to like be noodling around in this little vague, little huge vague place, and then be like, all right, now I just need to do a fucking downward dog, or like run around, or like lift weights. Like, so I need to do something that's not dumber, but like more familiar. So there's this really rich dialogue in that too. Okay, so less is sometimes more. All right, and third principle, maybe something like, this is the thing I find myself saying a lot, and I don't know if I'm ever clear enough, but I'm also working on getting clear, which is that like what we call thought starts as movement. And I'll say that again, what we call thought starts as movement. So I'm like kind of deep in figuring out what that means. It feels like a big truth to me, if there are any big truths. And it's something like the decision-making processes that my very cells make intelligently, that they're not following a plan, they're emergently, generatively, like doing their thing in response to each other in community from the time we're conceived to now. And so there's an illusion of control that I think, like, that my brain or nervous system are doing it, which I think is just a Western scientific interpretation of like ego illusion. And so underneath, like, or inside of, however we want to dimensionally describe it, like underneath my verbal thought, what does thought feel like without words? Is it an emotional feeling in my body? Is it a sensation that I can't name? Is it a pattern of movement I do? How does the thought even manifest in my relational patterns, like in my relationships? How does the very like fine-tuned, incredible, miraculous decision making of all of my cells at every moment that I can't think about in a way we think of thinking, that I can't manage, like that to me is where thinking starts, and is equally as intelligent as me being able to talk to you right now and put words to things. There's something super important for us as linguistic beings, and it's not the whole story. And I see that getting in the way of people being able to feel what thought is beyond words.
And why does that feel so important and so juicy for you?
Because as important as language is, it gets in the way of us feeling ourselves. It's like one tool among many. And there's something important about, to me, I'm even just going to say, like, in my communities, like politically on a grand scale, and in how I like know myself and relate to others, there's something really important in remembering that, like, the grassrootsness of my cells doing their thing that I don't have to manage or attend to will happen best if I'm not managing or attending to it. And that those parts of me, the cells, grew, decided to grow a nervous system because for some, they needed this more complex system of semi-central communication, but it's not in charge. So that's part of it too, is that that's the like Western scientific way of engaging with ego illusion without knowing it, is like the brain is doing all the thinking, like maybe my nervous system's important too, but everything else is inert. There's this unexamined dualism in it that I think inhibits us from being our most choiciest selves.
It's the part that starts to feel very mushroom trippy for me.
Totally, totally. It
Listening to
always
you
goes
talk about
there, which I mean, and that's an important part of my life. And it's also important to see the sort of where experiences we would call trippy or psychedelic arise within us because of something unnameable.
Yeah, definitely. Um, so let's see. What was the first? There was more is not always better.
Yeah.
Less
um,
can be.
Follow
What
your
was
curiosity,
that's right. And then
and what we call thought starts as movement.
I love that. I love that. I also, I mean, we've been talking about it a lot, but the way that you are so sort of dialed in and intentional about your language use. And yeah, I find that really unique in this space as well. I think that um I guess the non-judgmental piece that you brought up a couple of times in this conversation as well. I think, yeah, I don't know about a core philosophy, but it feels like something very unique and important about your work from what I know of your work so far.
Oh, that I also really appreciate hearing that those are my intentions. So it means a lot that that's coming through. And what was I gonna say? I mean, I love language, so even though I'm like, sometimes I'm like just utterly exasperated by logocentricity. I also love big words. And that's just like a part of my teaching. And so especially if I use really big ones in my teaching, I will often be like, here's a big word that I love. You don't have to love it. You don't have to remember it. Please, like, if it gets in the way of your experience, ignore it. For me, the words and the anatomy, like, that's a way into feeling myself. And those things, they're just tools. They can also be ways that prohibit people from feeling themselves. It's so individual, and what I need in different moments is always changing too. And so it's more like, for me, I both take great pleasure in that rigor, in being really precise with my words, in creating a precise container. And I think that's also why I like the sciencey part, like the Western Anatomy Foundation and embryology. And to me, having a really concrete container with those things then lets the more like nebulous, psychedelic, wordless stuff arise. And that's again just how it works for me. Other people might need different containers, but I feel like if the container is sort of strong enough, then and it's not going to work for everyone, but then we can go really deep, weird, strange places. And so that's my aim with the specificity that I also happen to take great joy in.
Nice. Yeah, it's something I'm super tuned into these days. I just, like you say, it's so hard to create that container well because it is just trying to point at stuff. And the deeper I go in my own internal process, the more I'm just always like, oh my God, how the fuck would I ever describe this to anybody? Like these tiny little moves, and they're so, yeah, just trying to come up with ways to point. And obviously, it's only my own moves, and it's going to be so different for everybody. So I think it's just a real artistry of coming up with good verbal cues and then doing it in a way that's co-arising with whoever you're working with in a meaningful way. I mean, I think it's something I really want to bring into my body work. So I appreciate that from
Cool.
you.
That's so exciting. I want there to be more somatic everything, but I'm super psyched to keep hearing about your like somatic massage journey.
Yeah, yeah, it's really hard to figure out how to talk about what it is that I do because like at this point I'm wondering if I should like start just using the word massage as infrequently as possible because it's like it ends up looking pretty different, I think, from people's idea of massage. But yeah, it's again the word thing that we're talking about. It's hard for me to even figure out a way to point at what I'm trying to do to get the right people to come show up in my space to work together.
No, that's such a real question. Kind of like I said, like I'm having with yoga. I mean, I still do teach yoga and but I'm like figuring out how to make it make sense to others, and like boxes and containers and are important and helpful. And I'm also, I sounds like you are too. I'm in a place where they like break down and I'm like, okay, how do I qualify this? So
Similarly, I'm super curious to ask you about this. I feel like you're gonna have an interesting take. At some point in my journey, I started, well, I guess bumping up against running into this stuff that I would now call energy body stuff, energetic phenomena. And I find it exceptionally difficult to talk about and also just very confusing to model. There are plenty of cultures and lineages out there that have been talking about this for a really long time and have all kinds of words and models for it. But I have a lot of trouble connecting some of this energy body stuff and energy models with physical body stuff and physical models. And I know that what I'm doing in these bodywork sessions is very related to both, but I don't know, I'm just in this weird place of confusion with it sort of. And I also um I talk about it a lot with certain friends in a way where it feels like there's enough shared context to sort of not need really precise language around it, but I don't talk about it much more widely because I don't really know how to talk about it yet. And I'm curious sort of how you think of these, maybe you could call them different layers of the body, one of which might be the energy body, or if you don't think about it that way, or sort of how they relate for you. You kind of said earlier these different facets of the jewel.
yeah, and I would say that I would, if I like engage in the schema of sort of separating parts of myself, which is can be really helpful as like facets of a jewel. Like there's a like in like yoga philosophy that, you know, the what we could call the energy body is sort of one sheath or one. I don't love Sometimes I'm moving away from language like sheath, even though I've said inside and outside. I'm both like using that language and sometimes like poking at it. So, and that's where the limits of language start to show. They both help, like language both helps and like both like occludes, both like hides and elucidates all at once. It's very exciting and fun, and sometimes really frustrating when you like hit up against its limits. Um, but so I would say then the energy body, like the reason why I started to say I don't like sheath is because, or maybe I do like it. I don't know. We have layers. What dimensions are the layers in? I do not know. So if I start to just think of myself as sheaths in an only three-dimensional way, I think that's too flat, even though it's not flat. It's still too only three-dimensional or something. I'm gonna set that aside. But that because that could be a whole wonderful thing to stab at. And so so I am also digging into what our energy bodies could be, like what could we be feeling in Western scientific terms. That said, energy body maps like the chakras, for instance, from yoga are a body map that I think has been translated over the centuries that once meant very different things than it means today. And but that was sort of my first exposure to what we could say like the energy body or the subtle body. I think there are many, many maps and ways in to experience it. And that was one that drew me in. That was kind of what led me to yoga was I was into the occult in high school and I found chakras to be incredibly beautiful and captivating. And then at a certain point, I was like, oh, I feel like I'm just mapping an outside picture onto my body. What do my cells and tissues themselves have to say about the colors, about the sounds, about everything, about the emotions, the sort of everything that comes with chakra study or practice? I worked with them a lot for a while, and I really don't anymore right now because I felt saturated and like there's so many outside in ideas from the chakras that they were like getting in the way of me feeling myself. So now I, well, I'll tell a story. So then last year, was it last year? Was it only, it was only this year. Wait, no, it's 2023 now. Anyway, what is time? And especially for me in the past like year, time is like totally dilated and condensed. Anyway, it was last year, it was almost a year ago-ish, I think, that I did the like endocrine components of my somatic training. And I know that there are these associations between the endocrine glands and their locations sort of along our spines and the chakras. And I went in like, I'm definitely not feeling any of that. Like, I want to feel what my cells say. I want to feel what my glands and neurotransmitters and hormones and their cycles say. I don't want to, no chakras here. And because I didn't want the map to get in the way of me feeling the territory. And so then, but lo and behold, I had these sort of energetic experiences with a visual component of like standing waves, or I've described them as cymatics sometimes in my writing, but of like patterned orbs emanating not just in my body, but out from it in sort of halos of different sizes and different configurations that could be chakra like, where I was like, oh, well, fuck, this is amazing. And so I don't know if the, like, again, I don't know if those are chakras or not. Again, I kind of think that, especially as a Westerner, that, but in general, I think what chakra practice was has like from like teacher to student has probably been lost, at least to like people who are so far from even being a non-initiate as me. And so, because they were part of like tantric systems of initiation and things that I think probably outsiders don't totally understand. But I had this very palpable feeling that at least some of what we could call energy body is me feeling like Is it me feeling like electromagnetism in my body? Maybe. Is it me feeling like my hormonal aura and and then my like exocrine aura, which would be like my shared endocrine system with people around me in space. Um, all of that and more, I think, are our energy bodies. I think our energy body is like a vague term, a little like somatics for talking about experiences that are hard to pin down, but that are something emergent from, not from having a body, emergent from being bodied. That, so I think it can refer to a lot of things, but it's something like experiencing the rhythms and cycles of ourselves in a multidimensional way.
Hmm. Yeah, the rhythm and cycle aspect feels really important and maybe left out of that conversation sometimes.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm using those words. That's how it feels to me. And I'm using the words because that's a lot of like what I got from diving more deeply into my endocrine system, was the sort of, really in a way, that's some of the tone of what our endocrine systems do, is like sort of managing like daily cycles and monthly cycles and the arc of our lives.
Nice. I mean, you talk about it a little bit there with the the way that the chakra map is talked about now and the way that people practice with it. Are there any like pet peeves that you have in the somatics world, or just common misconceptions that are sort of out there in the mainstream dialogue?
Yeah. Um, I definitely have plenty of them, and and think about them a lot. And I don't know why I'm going blank now. um, some of it I would say is like kind of what we've touched on already, like a lack of rigor. It's not like there are right words for things. Like again, I think like language is always a like shared negotiation. And when I meet with different people, I love the practice of learning to speak a common language so we can understand one another. So I have a lot that I'm bringing in, but I also listen to what my clients or students say and try to like, I'm doing a certain amount of teaching, but they're doing a certain amount of teaching to me so that we can meet in the middle. And like, it depends on the community that one is in. And so like in the yoga world, I could get away with saying something like blossom your heart open, and people would probably take that at face value and do something. They broaden their collarbones, or I don't know, or lift their sternum, or like it would be accessible to a lot of people without question, even if they did different things or had different ideas about what it meant. And I also, for a long time, I taught in like therapeutic communities, like residential communities for people who were um, uh, surmounting substance use disorders. And so, and who didn't come from yoga backgrounds. Now and then there'd be a person with a yoga background, but where there wasn't the kind of flowery vocabulary that's taken for granted didn't work. And it got me, that was such a good lesson of being like, oh, I need to be clear. And clear meant a lot of different things. Sometimes even bend your knees. Once I met a person and like bend your knees didn't work. And I was like, what do I say? I don't remember what I ended up saying. And
And they didn't know what you meant when you said that.
yeah, so I just had to be like, here, look at what I'm doing with my knees, which is fine. But it still can be like really valuable to learn to tease it out in language. But where like blossom your heart open wouldn't have made sense. So I had to be like, okay, what am I actually doing? What do I want to convey to them that they might do in their bodies? So it helped me get really clear and start to shed some of the language. I mean, poetic language is awesome. I love it. I engage with that too, but so maybe like my like not engaging with the practice of digging into things more clearly or rigorously. Maybe that's my, if I had to pick one big pet peeve, it's like it's maybe the woo-ness of it. And I'm so specific. Maybe my other, I sometimes feel misapprehended. Now and then people will be like, oh, well, you're so woo, where I'm like, what? I'm like the least woo person I know. Do you understand? And that still confounds me. I don't totally know what that is. I think, but I seem to be learning it's coming from people who think thought isn't movement, like who haven't felt themselves underneath, they haven't felt their wordlessness, maybe. But I'm trying to learn how to engage with that. I still don't always know. I'm still just like, what do you mean I'm woo? I'm like the meta woo or anti woo. Don't you see me? Yeah. So maybe
Yeah,
that's my pet peeve is actual woo-ness. And like, how do I help people have experiences they might call woo from like the least woo place? Meaning from a like rigorous foundation of like, I mean, I like the sciencey stuff because sometimes it's stuff that actually exists. I say sometimes because it's also a lot of wrong and bad stories, actually. And so teasing that out is also fun. Like, what's happening physiologically? What structures are there? And also, like, what stories have been told about it from like the history of Descartes and dissection in the Catholic Church? And like, yeah.
yeah, cool. I feel like I have yeah, just a similar issue in a lot of spiritual spaces where it's like I don't even know what y'all are talking about. The wording is so, it's like it's not even that I necessarily think it's what you're getting at is wrong or like I disagree with it, but it's yeah, it's frustrating. It's very it can also just feel like there are all of these can feel really dogmatic. Can feel like there are all of these there's just a new set of beliefs that's expected to be shared and then it's very vague language kind of pointing at that.
Yeah. No, I'm kind of allergic to that. And like, I believe that all spiritual practice arises from our personal and shared embodiment and from the feelings of our bodies moving. And I'm so willing to like go there and get weird with people. Like that's what I'm doing. I live for that. And but I feel you. I have trouble in a lot of sort of like new age and spiritual spaces, which and I'm in a lot of those spaces because of the work I do. And so or yeah, again, the like tension between the rigor of the science and then being like, and here's all this like weird, crazy stuff happening between us and in me. And like, wow, I feel the room feels really crazy right now. Did you feel that change? Like, what was that? Um, Wait, we're getting some shared imagery. Oh, we're not. We're having totally different experiences. Like all of it that comes up is so rich. And the vagueness you're talking about does not get me there. And
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a feeling of feel like I even have feelings of unsafety in that vagueness. Like maybe it's me too. I need really clear parameters. I think that's part of it. And so I teach from that.
Yeah, interesting. I feel like I don't have a rigorous foundation yet, so I feel like I don't want to do the annoying, super vague, super woo stuff, and I don't. I also don't have the rigorous part, so it's like I just shouldn't talk that much about any of this yet.
So
It's like it's sort of a thing of like I don't know. I think I'm still in my research phase, and like one day I hope to have smart enough things to say to actually talk about this stuff because I feel so much and I feel so um there's such a there for me and I feel so connected to yeah to the work I do and I gotta I think that's I think that that's a big part my guess would be for a lot of the people who are doing that kind of annoying very vague pointing is just not having the rigorous sort of background to really know what they're talking about to be able to speak from that place.
yeah. And I think anything we do, we have to do it from a meta perspective. Like whatever it is, to me, being sort of critical about it in a not in a bad way, like critical of like looking at what we're doing, whatever it is super important to me. And I think that's part of it too. Actually, you said this a moment ago that like there's something about woo where it can be dogmatic. And I find that it's recapitulating all the stuff that it seems to be evolving away from, or it says it's evolving away from, but it's just recapitulating the same structure with different words. And I find that really unsatisfying. Like I'm very interested in both. Like I talked about the cellular a lot, but I'm also interested in like a bird's eye view or like a cosmos eye view of the structures we're engaging with and like the meaning we're making. And I don't know. I think you're on the path, to use a kind of vague way of saying it. I feel like until recently I mean, I'm still always in my research phase, and I feel like something just happened for me a few months ago where I like was like, okay, I'm not like ever out of my research phase, but like suddenly all the like gestating and like internal exploration I've been doing, all of a sudden I'm like, blah, here it all is, which feels good. It feels like a motoring out of like all the stuff I've been ruminating on that feels good to be like, oh wow, I can actually articulate this thing that I couldn't articulate a few months ago and be like, oh, but there's still this other place that's really vague. Okay, I'm gonna dive in there.
Oh,
I love the word research. I love that.
well, that's exciting for you. That feels like a big transition point or something.
Yeah, no, it does. And it feels good. Like again, it feels good. It feels like I did so much like I don't know, preparing, exploring something that was really internal. And now I have like I came back with things I can say that kind of make sense.
Nice. Luckily,
Yeah.
I picked the modality where I don't have to talk that much, so I can also just like work on people and like hold the best space I can and be like, I don't even know what the fuck I'm doing, but if it helps you, great. So there's that until I get to a point where I can actually talk about it intelligently. Um, I would love to ask you a little bit, just more generally, I guess. So this is a podcast where I interview healers, which is uh on the topic of vagueness, kind of a vague, hard to define word, but I from having attended a couple of your classes, I would absolutely put you in that category. And I'm just curious what advice you would have for people starting out in a healing or maybe more generally a helping profession like yoga, somatics, body work, acupuncture, energy work, medicine, anything kind of in
Yeah,
that.
in any of those. And you even said medicine, like so I love how the breath that you're including in like quote healing work. Um and I think I could say first the same sort of word of caution to anyone going into any of those fields, as diverse as they are, which is to like drop the bullshit about what healing is. This is for the doctors with shitty bedside manners, and this is for the 200-hour yoga teachers who want to call themselves healers, and then the people in between who we are supporting people in their healing. But what is healing? Healing is changing our relationship to stuff in our lives or people in our lives. Is like having more choices, and that's why I'm like trying to use that more neutral language. Healing might not mean my like it, to take a kind of a darker example, it may not mean my cancer is cured, but it may mean how I relate to my cancer and my own mortality is shifted, and I can be in the world more in the way that I want to for the little time that I have. So healing means something it's may mean being free of disease, but it may mean being easeful around disease or changing my relationship to it. And so, to all healers, I would say to remember that healing isn't, I'm not healing someone, a doctor's not healing someone. Like I have expertise, a doctor does, an acupuncturist does, a massage therapist does. We have a certain expertise we bring to the table in a dialogue or in a conversation, and but I can only support someone else in their own healing process. So I can facilitate for that for them by offering ideas, offering expertise, offering practices. The healing though is happening from them. It's happening within. And I would even go as far to say it may be happening in their sort of body mind and what we might call a top down way, but maybe more often it's even happening in a like bottom up way, or it's a two-way street, or it's so multidimensional I can't describe it. But that healing is never an outside in thing. It's always an inside out thing. And the power is in the like relationship to self and to quote healer and the container that you're able to create. And we can't, I can do my best to create a safe healing space for people, and I can't create that for everyone. There are definitely like things to do and things not to do. And I can't be the right teacher or like healer for everyone. But
Is,
again, it's about the like relationship we have with people.
yeah, I love that. Is there anything else that you would say? We've talked about it a bit, I know already, but is there anything else that you would add sort of specifically about the creation and maintenance of that container?
Of like the healing container.
Mhm.
You mean, yeah, I mean, now yeah, like again, remembering we can't do it for everyone. And so it's often not personal if it's not a good fit for whatever reason. Um, but there are plenty of things that would be kind of the basics of like professionality and ethics and integrity and like being with people in vulnerable places if you're like giving massage or or any kind of hands-on, right? There are all kinds of conversations that are like bedrock about consent and about like, so that's what I kind of mean, are things that are unfortunately not obvious and that I think do really need to be talked about. But so in a way, I mean that found the foundation, like that clear foundation. And again, I think even in the acknowledgement, not that I can't create a safe space, so I shouldn't try, but that I can't know what's going on for a person and how they're reacting to me. So I still have to do my best, but for whatever reason, I might remind them of their mother, or I don't know, or their sister, or something that does not work, and they might need to work with another person. And I think that's true of like therapists, of all, like the talk therapists too, right? Of like anyone there. First, there might be some reason why it's not a good fit, and it's not personal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there any advice that you have sort of from a business or entrepreneurial perspective? Like, I don't know that much about your personal life. What I know of your professional life, it seems I think something I admire about you is that you are many years into this journey, and it seems like you're still doing really cool classes all the time, cool trainings and courses, and traveling and getting with amazing teachers and learning all the time. And I am really inspired that you've designed your life in a way that you're getting to teach what you love and also study what you love all the time. And I want to be doing that and want to make that work financially in the modern world. And I'm curious, not just from that perspective, I guess any sort of entrepreneurial or business advice you would have to people starting out in this type of work.
I mean, that part is really hard, especially starting out like I'm still established enough that I have like some sort of clout and experience to rest on, and it's still hard. It's a saturated market, and I've I'm kind of a lifelong student, and I love the learning of it, and I know I will do that forever. At a certain point, it might be me and I imagine my like somatic cohort that I'm with now, and I imagine us in like 20 or 30 years like still like geeking out together and exploring and noodling around, and like we already do things where we take turns teaching each other and then like give feedback and like I don't know, or draw together or whatever, and that's so rich and I love it. So that kind of research will always continue, but I'm still in a place where I'm like, the more I learn, the more I'm like, wow, the more I like, all I learn is how little I know. Even if I, in some ways, kind of know a lot and it's great to be able to say that now. I'm like, oh, but I want to learn about this, but I want to learn about that. And so some of it is just, am really curious about it and want to go deeper. And I picked a program like body mind centering can keep you busy for 20 years. If you want to do it, like it, you can keep training in it. Also, so I picked one that's very long-winded. I don't know if I picked it for that reason, but that's a good fit for me. Um, so I kind of got a field from what I was saying, which is that part keeps me engaged and keeps it fresh. Because there are definitely periods in any career of like sort of peaks and like valleys, but then plateaus, especially as a teacher, there are going to be times where it feels like you're on autopilot, or maybe not autopilot. I think that's usually a sign to like take a break or a step back, but there'll be plateau moments where I'm like, oh, I'm so tired of hearing myself say this thing. And I have to remind myself it doesn't land immediately for students. They need to hear things a lot. Like it's new to them. They don't hear me teach 20 classes a week saying the same thing. So they don't hear me saying it, even though I get tired of it. So there's a certain amount of patience with like being where you are. There's patience for me to cultivate right now and being like, I'm in this weird place in between teaching yoga and somatics. That's sometimes a blend that works really well, but sometimes I like just want to teach more of the somatics. And then recently, as I've been doing more of that, I started falling in love with teaching yoga again. So um so some of it is just is like patience for where you are. I think as a teacher, continuing to learn is super important so it stays fresh. And so we're always offering something that is better, more in integrity, and because it's also that's part of our process of self-study, which is really what lets us come into offering more to people. So so continuing to study, whatever that looks like, continuing to practice, um, is super important. And the markets are so saturated. There's so many. Like I am really pushing through a lot of imposter syndrome as I try to teach online more. Like I'm a very confident teacher in person, and online I can see how far I've come in 3 years since the beginning of the pandemic. Before that, I was like, I don't want to teach online. Fuck that. Now there's more of a market for it, and I'm in touch with students from back east, and there are a lot of reasons to be online. So I'm kind of pushing that. So I'm also like talking down the voices that are like, there's so many people, what do I have to offer? Because what I would say to each of my students is like, our individuality is what we offer and what makes the like grand symphony of what makes it good to be alive. So some of it is like nose to the ground, like uh steady work. And for people really starting out, it might be not quitting your day job, or it might mean waiting tables or doing something else while you kind of get your chops. And it's a long road and hard. And there's definitely been a lot of like financial struggle for me choosing to do it. For me, it didn't feel like another choice. I felt like I was choosing my happiness in teaching and doing what I really want to do with my life. Like we have to work for such a large percentage of our lives. I want to do something that I like doing. Having the jobs I had before teaching were mostly soul killing. And I somehow was allergic enough. I was like, screw this. I will be a starving yoga teacher for a while. But it's hard, and like the market's shifting, what people want is shifting because of online, because of the pandemic. Like, so I think people have to be open to like, yeah, you might have to pull some espressos sometimes too for a little while. That's okay.
Is there anything that you wish more people knew about you?
Lately, it's been the woo thing where I want to be like, like, so not woo. What do you mean? Like, see me. That's one thing. And yeah, it's funny, it's getting into like deep questions of me wondering how I come off. I like am learning to show my like is maybe different than like the community we know each other in, but especially professionally, I'm learning to show my sense of humor more. because I can be really wordy and kind of serious. And I'm learning to like titrate that, which is hard. I definitely can see my history of teaching and teaching in trainings and like giving too much information. So I'm like learning to balance that with like my silly self because I am a really silly, goofy person. And for a long time, I feel like I separated that from my work. So maybe I would want people to know that. It might be, I might have succeeded enough that my students would be like, yeah, you're kind of goofy. You did it. But but I would tell, in my professional capacity, I would say that that even if I seem really serious sometimes and like I'm talking about it like hyper focused on a thing, that can shake me out of that and we can have fun.
Nice. Nice. Yeah, I'm kind of trying to bring in something similar in that like when I started with bodywork, I even had a teacher who was like, Jane, you always have like a really serious look on your face when you're massaging people. And I realized that like trying to like wanting to throw my passion into it was just like coming across very seriously. And I've noticed like, especially when working with really intense emotional stuff, if you are able to like laugh about it, it just totally changes the game. So I'm trying to find
Yeah.
ways to like bring that in. I would never want it to feel like disrespectful to somebody or inappropriate, you know, but I have found that finding creative ways to bring in levity can be super helpful in my work.
Yeah, I mean, I think I love that. I just wrote a note, like wrote like passion and seriousness, because that really resonates for me. And yeah, I think there's something too to about taking myself too seriously, which definitely I think we all do a little bit of that. And that's like a tender spot for me, probably for a lot of folks, but there can be a place where I can be like more in my rigor, where I can also like let go of a little bit of it sometimes and like because I am just really passionate about it and then like be like, okay, like time to play. Like that's enough rigor.
Nice. Um, I feel like we've covered quite a lot. Is there anything from what we talked about over this almost 2 hours that you want to go into deeper or say something else about?
I don't think so. That
Cool.
felt so like thorough and like we spiraled around. Yeah.
Yeah, nice. Well, thank you so much. It's so nice to talk to you, and I feel like yeah, I feel like I have a much better sense of your work now, and I also it really makes me want to try some one-on-one work with you. Like I don't think I saw quite so many parallels in our work before, and it makes me really curious to work with you individually, of course for my own sake, and also this is something that I love when I go get different body work or different like therapies and things, is I can also feel like I'm kind of doing my homework. So,
Right on. Cool.
oh,
No, I would love to just continue the conversation together too, because I love it. And I'm learning through this conversation we're even more like aligned or cohered or something than I thought we were. It's very
awesome.
cool.
Awesome. Where can people find more information about you and about working with you?
For my professional stuff, they can go to bexnaj.yoga, which I'll spell. So it's BEXNAJ.YOGA.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bex.
Thank you so much, Jane.